high in the mist-covered mountains of Appalachia. There was once a people who didn't quite belong anywhere. They weren't white. They weren't black. They weren't Native American. Yet they lived here, hidden along remote ridges, deep hollows, and winding mountain paths. Long before most Americans ever knew these mountains existed, for centuries, locals whispered about them. Newspapers wrote about them. Scientists argued over them. Who were they really? Portuguese sailors? Lost colonists? Survivors of ancient Mediterranean empires? And then, something even stranger happened. By the mid-20th century, they simply vanished. No war, no massacre. No clear answers. Tonight, we uncover the true story behind Appalachia's lost tribe, the Melungeons, separating myth from history, legend from fact, and asking one haunting question: did they disappear, or did they blend into us? The mountains of Appalachia have always been good at hiding things. Thick forests, steep ridges, and narrow hollows created natural walls between the outside world and the people who lived within them. Long before highways or railroads ever cut through these hills, entire communities existed in isolation, unseen, unheard, and largely forgotten. And among them lived a group of people who would one day puzzle historians. More than almost any other population in American history, they were known as the Melungeons. Not a tribe in the traditional sense, not immigrants in any documented way, and not easily placed into America's rigid racial categories. Their very existence raised uncomfortable questions in a young nation obsessed with labels. What made the Melungeons so mysterious wasn't just where they lived. It was how they looked. Descriptions from the 18th and 19th centuries mention dark, wavy hair, olive or reddish-brown skin, sharp European-style facial features, and eyes that ranged from deep brown to gray. Some even noted a small ridge or bump at the back of the head, a detail that fueled rumor and speculation for generations. Neighbors couldn't decide what they were seeing. These people didn't resemble nearby native tribes, yet they didn't resemble European settlers either. In a time when America demanded simple answers, white or black, free or enslaved, the Melungeons existed somewhere in between, and that unsettled people. For the Melungeons themselves, identity was not a mystery, it was survival. They lived mostly atop remote ridges in eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia, places like Newman's Ridge, far from fertile farmland and even farther from government attention. They married within their own communities, kept to themselves, and avoided outside conflict whenever possible. Not because they were secretive by nature, but because history had taught them caution. In an America where race determined your rights, your land ownership, even your safety, being difficult to define could be dangerous. And so the Melungeons stayed quiet, living ordinary mountain lives, farming thin soil, raising families, worshipping in small churches, while the outside world slowly began to notice that something didn't quite add up. Life on the Appalachian ridges was never easy, but for the Melungeons, isolation became both a refuge and a necessity. Newman's Ridge and the surrounding hollows were steep, rocky, and unforgiving, land most settlers didn't want. The soil was thin, crops were unpredictable, and winters could feel endless. Yet this harsh landscape offered one priceless thing: distance. Distance from courts, census takers, slave catchers, and a society that demanded answers the Melungeons could not safely give. Up on the ridge, they built small cabins, cleared narrow patches of land, and lived by the rhythm of the mountains rather than the laws of the lowlands. Daily life looked much like that of other Appalachian families, farming corn and beans, raising hogs, hunting game, and trading when necessary. Children worked early, learning survival before schooling. Churches served as social centers, not grand buildings, but modest meeting places where faith and community intertwined. Despite their isolation, the Melungeons were not primitive or disconnected. They understood the land deeply, where water flowed during drought, how fog predicted weather, which paths remained passable after storms. The mountains weren't just where they lived. They were how they lived. Every ridgeline and creek bend carried memory, protection, and meaning. Yet even within this quiet mountain life, tension always lingered. When Melungeons traveled off the ridge to trade or work, questions followed them like shadows. "What are you?" people would ask, not out of curiosity alone, but judgment. Their ambiguous identity often led to exclusion from schools, churches, and legal protections. Many learned to avoid confrontation, offering vague answers or simply keeping silent. Over time, this silence became tradition, passed from parent to child. Speak little, trust carefully, stay close to your own. In a world eager to define and divide, the Melungeons survived by blending into the mountains themselves, visible, yet unseen. For generations, the Melungeons lived quietly in the Appalachian highlands, largely unnoticed by the outside world. But history has a way of leaving footprints, even in the most remote places. As early as the late 1600s, French explorers traveling through the interior of North America reported encountering people in the mountains who were neither Native American nor European. Settlers. These men didn't fit known categories. They spoke differently, looked different, and lived in areas far removed from established colonies. At the time, such reports were brushed aside. The frontier was full of rumors, and few officials cared enough to investigate further. By the late 1700s, however, written evidence became harder to ignore. During the brief and chaotic era of the proposed state of Franklin, leaders in East Tennessee began documenting unusual settlements scattered through the mountains. One official noted a group of dark-complexioned people living apart from both whites and native tribes, claiming descent from Portuguese ancestry. They reportedly referred to themselves by a distinct name, not European, not indigenous, and not African. Then came an even more telling moment. In the 1795 federal census, the government recorded hundreds of free persons of color living in a region where slavery barely existed and where the black population was extremely small. The numbers simply didn't match known demographics. As the 1800s progressed, curiosity turned into fascination. Newspaper articles began appearing across the country describing a strange race. In the Appalachian Mountains, writers traveled to Newman's Ridge, sketching faces and recording physical traits as if they were studying a relic of the past. Some described Mediterranean features. Others claimed the people looked foreign despite having lived in America for generations. Scientists, historians, and amateur researchers arrived hoping to solve the puzzle, yet each visit only deepened it. No single explanation fit. The Melungeons had no clear rival story, no written origin, and no homeland anyone could point to. By the end of the 19th century, one thing was undeniable. Appalachia was hiding a chapter of American history no one fully understood. Once the Melungeons entered the national spotlight, theories exploded in every direction. Historians, journalists, and scholars all wanted the same thing: an origin story that made sense. Some believed the answer lay across the Atlantic. One of the earliest and most widely repeated claims was that the Melungeons were descendants of Portuguese sailors whose ships had wrecked along the Carolina coast centuries earlier. According to the theory, these survivors moved inland, marrying Native Americans and gradually pushing west into the mountains. Supporters pointed to family surnames, facial features, and even oral traditions passed down through generations. To many outsiders, this explanation felt plausible, romantic, mysterious, and comfortably European. But others believed the story went even deeper. Another powerful theory connected the Melungeons to the Lost Colony of Roanoke, one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. When the English settlers vanished in the late 1500s, the only clue left behind was a single word carved into wood. Some researchers argued that the colonists may have assimilated into native tribes, already mixed with Spanish or Portuguese blood over generations. These blended communities could have moved inland, eventually becoming the people later known as Melungeons. It was a theory filled with haunting possibilities, not disappearance, but transformation. Still, no documents, no clear trail, and no undeniable proof ever surfaced. Then came the most controversial ideas of all. Some researchers claimed the Melungeons were triracial, a mix of European, Native American, and African ancestry formed during the earliest days of colonial America. Others pushed even further, suggesting connections to Mediterranean peoples, including Moors who had once ruled parts of southern Europe. These theories often reflected the fears and biases of the time more than solid evidence. In an America deeply uncomfortable with racial complexity, the Melungeons became a canvas onto which people projected their assumptions. Each explanation said as much about society's need for categories as it did about the people themselves. And despite decades of debate, one truth remained stubbornly clear: no single theory could fully explain them. Long before English settlers reached the Appalachian frontier, Spanish explorers were already moving through the southeast in search of wealth, glory, and empire. In the 1500s, Spain dominated much of the New World, sending armed expeditions deep into unfamiliar territory. One of the most famous was led by Hernando de Soto, who marched hundreds of men across what is now the southern United States. His journey cut through river valleys, native towns, and mountain corridors, including areas that would later become eastern Tennessee. Along the way, his expedition faced disease, starvation, and constant conflict with indigenous nations. By the time de Soto died in 1542, nearly half his men were gone. This is where speculation begins. Some historians believe not all of de Soto's soldiers continued onward, exhausted, wounded, or disillusioned. Small groups may have deserted and disappeared into the mountains, surviving alone in foreign land. These men would have had little choice but to rely on native communities for survival. Over time, intermarriage and isolation could have created mixed populations long before English colonization ever began. While no written records confirm this directly, the routes de Soto traveled match strikingly well with later Melungeon settlements, particularly along river systems that naturally guided early movement through the Appalachians. Another Spanish explorer, Juan Pardo, adds even more weight to the mystery. In the 1560s, Pardo led expeditions north from Spanish Florida, building forts deep in the interior, including one near the French Broad River. These outposts were short-lived. Indigenous resistance soon destroyed them, killing many soldiers and scattering the survivors. Those who escaped vanished into the wilderness. Some researchers believe these men, cut off from Spain, unable to return, and forced to adapt, may have become the earliest ancestors of mountain communities. Later labeled Melungeon, if true, their story would not begin with immigration, but abandonment, not newcomers by choice, but people left behind by history itself. As America moved into the 19th century, the nation became increasingly obsessed with classification. Laws were written not just to govern behavior, but to define identity. Race determined where you could live, what land you could own, whether your children could attend school, and even whether your testimony counted in court. For the Melungeons, this era brought new danger. Because they did not fit neatly into accepted racial categories, the state labeled them as free persons of color. On paper, it sounded neutral. In reality, it stripped away rights and reinforced isolation. Suddenly, identity wasn't just a mystery, it was a legal burden. This classification had lasting consequences. Land ownership became limited, pushing Melungeon families onto the poorest and most inaccessible terrain, especially high ridges like Newman's Ridge. While white settlers claimed fertile valleys below, the Melungeons remained above, farming soil that barely produced enough to survive. Their children were often barred from white schools, forcing communities to create their own informal systems of learning. Churches sometimes refused them membership. Courts questioned their legitimacy. Over time, these restrictions quietly shaped where they lived, who they married, and how visible they could afford to be. Survival once again meant staying out of sight. Yet despite discrimination, the Melungeons endured. Families worked the land together, preserved their surnames, and passed down oral histories that spoke of distant origins. Portuguese blood, foreign ancestors, people who came from across the sea, whether symbolic or literal. These stories mattered. They provided dignity in a society that denied it. Still, as decades passed, pressure mounted. Younger generations looked down from the ridge and saw opportunity beyond isolation. Education, mobility, and acceptance lay below, but often at the cost of identity. And slowly, almost invisibly, the walls that once protected the Melungeons began to crumble. By the early 20th century, the world beyond the Appalachian ridges was changing fast. Roads cut through mountains. Public education expanded. Jobs pulled young people toward towns and cities. For the first time, Melungeon children were no longer confined to the ridge for survival. With schooling came mobility, and with mobility came choice. Many began leaving the only homes their families had known for generations. Some went to nearby towns. Others traveled much farther, and when they left, something quiet but profound began to happen. The Melungeons did not disappear all at once. They dispersed. Intermarriage became common. As Melungeons married outside their communities, physical traits softened across generations. Dark complexions faded. Mediterranean features blended. Surnames remained, but their meanings blurred. Many families chose not to speak openly about their origins, not out of shame, but exhaustion. For decades, identity had brought questions, suspicion, and discrimination. Passing as white, or at least unremarkable, offered safety. By the 1940s and 1950s, fewer people openly identified as Melungeon, not because they were gone, but because the world no longer forced them to explain themselves. By the 1960s, newspapers began reporting something astonishing. Appalachia's lost tribe had vanished. Researchers returned to Newman's Ridge expecting to find the same striking community described decades earlier. Instead, they found ordinary families, mixed backgrounds, blended features, modern lives. The dramatic physical markers were gone. The old isolation had dissolved. What once seemed like a separate people had merged into the broader American story. No tragedy marked the moment. No final chapter announced it. The Melungeons didn't vanish through destruction. They vanished through integration. And perhaps that made the mystery even more haunting. In the early 2000s, a new kind of evidence entered the conversation: DNA testing. For the first time, people across America could mail a small sample of saliva and receive a report claiming to reveal their ancestral past. Almost overnight, interest in Melungeon heritage exploded. Thousands of families began tracing surnames, studying old photographs, and sharing stories passed down by grandparents who once whispered about Portuguese blood or people from the ridge. What had once been hidden became something many were suddenly proud to claim. The lost tribe, it seemed, was being rediscovered. But science did not bring simple answers. Large-scale DNA studies conducted in the 2010s revealed a complex picture, not a single origin, but a mixture. Some individuals showed African ancestry, others Native American, many European. Often all three appeared in varying degrees. To some researchers, this confirmed the idea of the Melungeons as a triracial population formed during America's earliest colonial era. Yet even this explanation felt incomplete. Genetics can reveal where fragments come from, but not the full story of how, when, or why those fragments came together. DNA shows inheritance, not identity. And that may be the heart of the mystery. The Melungeon story resists clean conclusions because it was never simple to begin with. It unfolded across centuries of migration, exploration, survival, discrimination, and adaptation. It was shaped not only by bloodlines, but by laws, fear, geography, and silence. Perhaps the Melungeons were never meant to be understood as one origin or one people. Perhaps they represent something deeper in American history, the spaces between categories, the lives lived outside official records, the stories history almost forgot. They may not have disappeared at all. They may simply live on, in faces, in names, in mountain memories, quietly reminding us that not every past can be neatly explained. If you enjoy deep, mysterious American history like this, hit like. It really helps the channel grow. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story from Appalachia. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? These mountains have stories everywhere. And I'd love to know who's listening.